I'm very excited to introduce this amazing, last but not least, panel of incredible explorers that are going to talk to us about how they are creating new narratives. They're inventing new ways to tell us new stories so that we can really create a connection and empathy with the natural world. So let's jump into it because we have very limited time. To begin with, we will hear from National Geographic fellow Chris Golden.
We need a new narrative for nature. What I'm here to propose is that environmental conservation is the best public health intervention. Planetary health is a new field that explores the human health impacts of environmental change, whether looking at biodiversity loss, climate change, or land use change. Planetary health scientists are interested in examining these types of ecosystem transformations and their impacts on human health. The World Health Organization estimates that 1/4 of the entire burden of disease could be avoided through improved ecosystem management. This, to me, provides us with an enormous opportunity to correct certain health ills through protecting and managing our natural systems. It's a bit false for me to present in a section entitled New Narratives for Nature. Planetary health conceptualization is deeply rooted in indigenous knowledge. And so I owe a debt of gratitude to the amazing team and wonderful people that I've been working with over the past 20 years in Madagascar. I really see my role as assigning values and data to tell their stories of planetary health. And so it's in this spirit that I'll continue the rest of my presentation. These are some of the threats that we're facing. Globally, 40% of insect species are in decline. Researchers in Europe have found that insect species have experienced a 75% decline in abundance over the past 30 years. Similarly, wildlife populations have declined by 60% over the past 50 years. These are not statistics that are important just for biodiversity. They're critically important for human well-being and human health. Without insects, pollinated crops will decline or collapse. Without wildlife, people who rely on bushmeat for nutrition in the developing world will lack this resource. This is the type of research that I'd been doing for the past 10 years. And over that time, I began seeing headlines like this, and I wondered to myself, to what extent was the work that I was doing in rural, remote rainforests of Madagascar parallel to what was happening in the oceans? And I really got thinking about all of the statistics that were happening. Since 1996, fish catch has declined by 1 million metric tons per year. We also know that climate change has deep impacts on fish catch. Sea temperature rise will bring fish populations from the equator toward the poles. And as that happens, and as you can see here in the red area highlighted on the map along the equatorial belt, fish catch is expected to decline by 50% by 2050. As a public health specialist, when I look at this map, I see the very areas that we care the most about food insecurity and where there's a looming food crisis in our future. We need a new narrative for our oceans. More marine protected areas will help to safeguard biodiversity and replenish fish stocks that will feed the billions of people that rely on seafood for nutrition. This is something that we need to do. We need to reframe conservation as a public health intervention. This extends beyond the oceans. Forests are also critical for human health. I recently co-authored a study that analyzed data from 300,000 children in 35 different countries. What we found was that protecting upstream forests improved water quality downstream and reduced the incidence of diarrheal diseases. This is one of the major killers of children worldwide. And we found that forest conservation was actually equivalent in impact to many types of public health interventions. These are the types of stories we need to tell to create empathy for nature and to broaden the constituencies of those who care about it. It's not just about infectious disease or nutrition. It's also about mental health. Nature plays a major role in protecting our mental health. Solastalgia is defined as mental or existential distress driven by environmental degradation. And so we need more protected areas. We need green design of our cities. We need a more proactive approach to integrating nature into youth education and lifestyles to restore and protect our global mental health. National Geographic's orientation around a planet in balance is exactly what I mean by planetary health. National Geographic initiatives like 30 by 30 will do more than protect biodiversity. It will also protect the health and well-being of every person on this planet and future generations to come. Last week, the Juliana 21 young Americans, made their next steps in a case against the US government. The case was founded on the principle that they deserve the same protections as the Constitution provides everyone else: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The suit has promised them, the suit that they are intending to bring to the US government is in a hope that they'll be able to receive these same benefits in the future. And yet our current ecological transformations are preventing that safe space in the future from ecological change. They're demanding action now for protected areas and for us to follow climate-friendly policies so that they can live in a future that ensures their health and well-being. I find hope in this next generation to recognize the importance of nature and to protect and restore our planetary health. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Please now welcome Gautam Shah, National Geographic Fellow.
So when we were young, no one needed to make the case for nature for us. No one needed to explain the value of animals. All our books, our toys, our movies, our clothes, they were all about animals because they instinctively touched our hearts. But then we grew up, and other things like television, games, boyfriends and girlfriends started to demand our attention. Meanwhile, here we are, facing the extinction of the natural world and thinking about how can we make this important again. The good news is that there's actually a lot of evidence that animals and wildlife still capture our imagination. But with all these things competing for our time and for our attention, maybe it's, I didn't expect that reaction. Maybe it's not our role to justify or to defend or to make the case for nature, so much as it is to find new storytelling channels that are much more embedded into our daily lives. So after a career of 20 years in IT consulting, I finally decided to quit my perfectly good job and see whether we couldn't figure out how to do that. And one of the first things that I learned, and we're learning a lot about here this week, is all the advances in technology that allow us to generate multi-dimensional data about animals and habitats that we could never before have imagined. Drones let us recreate environments in 3D down to the individual bush. AI lets us comb through millions of photographs in a matter of seconds and identify individual animals simply from their spot patterns. And evidently, from space, we can count penguins. And hidden in all this scientific data is actually a treasure of stories just waiting to be told. So here's an example of a story of two lions based on just very simple GPS data.
Fleur and Valentine are sisters who live with their 6 adolescent cubs near Lake Elementita. As a pride, they remain close to each other 90% of the time for protection, cooperative hunting, and social bonding. When Valentine is ready to find a mate, she makes 2 trips into the adjoining Nakuru National Park. She remains in the area for approximately 3 days each time, probably accompanied by a male lion. On her second trip back to her pride, we see that something is blocking her way. The once non-functioning electric fence has been fixed, and she cannot get through. Valentine becomes stressed and hungry and nearly dies. Researchers intervene to transport Valentine back to Fleur and the rest of the pride. Soon after, she gives birth to 3 new cubs.
Now we want to take this type of data and make it far more interactive in a way that incentivizes people to come back and watch these type of things on a daily basis. And I can think of no better channel to try and do that than games. 2.2, I think it's 2.4 billion people since I made this slide, around the world play games. And almost none of those games are about nature or wildlife. Now, we spend millions of dollars every year creating nature documentaries, and I'm not at all saying that that's unjustified. But spending almost nothing trying to penetrate this market has always felt to me, borderline irresponsible. So we are currently working on our first full commercial game called Wilderverse. Wilderverse is a mobile, augmented reality game that sends you on missions to play the scientists studying apes in Congo and Borneo. You explore green spaces within your own city to try and track these animals and export the organizations that work with them. So think Pokemon Go, but with chimpanzees and orangutans. But where the animal characters are real, the habitats are real, and the researchers that work with them are real. So what you're looking at here is an example of how we're trying to recreate the feeling of tracking Theo the orangutan through your mobile phone. Oops. Well, anyhow, you've seen the slide ahead of time. The experiences that we create can range from educational to whimsical, but they always focus on the data that all of you are already gathering to try and bring people into worlds that they're unfamiliar with, not unsimilar to the way that concerts or television or sports might do. So could you use your Fitbit to compete with Moituri the elephant on who took the most steps today? Or could you teach geography or geometry through a real-time virtualization of Gorongosa National Park? Or maybe could you place bets on the annual migration of Arctic terns? And how could those experiences turn into or catalyze new business models that finance conservation work on the ground? Technology and data are on our side. We just have to use them to find storytelling approaches that are more relevant to our daily lives right now. So we're going to continue to build upon these concepts until Fleur the lion and Chili the gibbon are as important as Beyoncé and Lionel Messi and Game of Thrones. Because when we do that, that's when we'll know that we're truly making the case for nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Gautam. Now, please welcome our last presenter, National Geographic Fellow, Anan Varma.
As a kid, I was obsessed with aquariums. I had 7 aquariums in my home. I set up an aquarium in my middle school classroom. And the day I turned 14, I got a work permit so I could start my job at Wildside Pets, my local aquarium store. There is something about staring into a glowing box of life that calms me down. It focuses my attention, and it puts me in a mood to ponder the questions of the universe. This particular aquarium happens to be in my home in Berkeley. I started this fellowship project on jellyfish with David Gruber in New England. And he introduced me to Steve Spina at the New England Aquarium, who has become an incredible jelly mentor to me. And there was a day last year where I realized I could be doing this project back home. So I called my mom, and she boxed up and shipped the equipment that had been in my parents' basement for 20 years. I inherited these jelly tanks from David Lichwager, who had just finished a story for National Geographic. And I had Steve ship me a box of jellies from Boston so I could reconnect with my childhood love. Now, to make space for these new housemates, I hired an assistant, Mark Unger, who used to work with the education team here. And together, we rebuilt the backyard storage shed I have into a makeshift jellyfish lab. And there's something about learning to care for these creatures that creates a kind of intimacy with them. For example, this little week-old baby moon jelly pulsing in a single drop of water. You spend all day, every day, staring at this little creature, and you start to wonder, how does this little creature know where it is? How does this little creature know where to go? It turns out the answer to those questions are in these little black dots at the base of its tentacles. In those little black dots is a gypsum crystal lying on a bed of sensory hairs. And together, that crystal and those hairs form a gravity sensor that tells this little baby jellyfish what direction it's pointing. So as this jellyfish swims through the ocean, that little crystal rolls around that bed of hairs, reminding it which way is up and which way is down. And it turns out that little gravity sensor is so similar to the gravity sensor in our inner ear that NASA sent 2,500 baby jellyfish into space to try to better understand how life is affected by microgravity. So here you have a grown-up moon jelly, and that gravity sensor is tucked in that little notch along the margin of its bell. This creature looks nothing like us. And yet, we share one important thing in common. We all need to figure out which way is up and which way is down. So, if we can learn from a jellyfish about life in outer space, what else can we learn from nature? Thank you.
I'm going to ask Chris and Gautam to join us again on stage so that we can start this conversation. That was powerful. Thank you so much, the three of you. To begin with, I'm really intrigued. What is your short definition, your understanding of what means creating empathy with the natural world? And whoever, we can start with you, Chris.
Sure. For me, I think that there's this undeniable feeling that you have when you go out into nature. It's something that I first experienced going on nature walks with my mom when I was little, and there's a sense of awe and wonder and discovery. And I think that that, for me, is the best way of describing that kind of empathy that you connect with nature.
Yeah, very similar. And I think it's about how do you create this feeling of being part of something, even though it might be far away. So it's not, although the National Geographic Explorers, they're out, they're doing their stuff, and somehow I should care about it. Like, how can I in some way feel part of it, no matter where I live?
Well, I think connection is central to everything that I work on. But I want to take a second to talk about empathy, because I think empathy is just one of those ways of connection, probably the most powerful. But, I was reading Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac this last year, and in it he describes cooking deer meat in bear fat over a campfire. And to me, he is one of the most important voices in conservation of the last 100 years, but I wouldn't use the word empathy to describe that activity. And I don't aspire to kill a bear or a deer, but it struck me that there is a lot of different ways to connect to the natural world. And I certainly try to create videos and photographs that allow you to put yourself into the experience of an individual, but I try to think about how to make content that allows people to connect to it in their own way.
Mm-hmm. Gautam, there's a craziness going on with video games. Like, there's like Nintendo Switch, Nintendo whatever, Atari, like every single, like Pokemon 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So how do we make this nature video games a trend? How do we put them on the mainstream so that everybody wants to play with those?
I think the hardest thing about like making the games, quite honestly, it's not that hard. There's a lot of work that's going out there on how you gamify, and we can gamify anything. What's really hard is the marketing and the positioning of it. So if you position, and there's a fine balance, but if you position it as a game for nature, or if you position it as a game for education or something like that, you've immediately boxed yourself in. And yes, you will definitely get the people that are interested in a game for nature, and for sure that will be fine, but you will not have reached a larger audience because they will immediately be like, oh, that's not for me. So there's a fine balance between making sure that it still is a game for nature, but it's marketed as like, this is just as fun as anything else that you might be playing, and it's something that you really, really inherently want to do. And then let the conservation and the nature and these type of stories come through. But first and foremost, it's one, you've got to make it fun. But then two, you need to make sure that when you're marketing it and when you're positioning it, that you're positioning it in the same way that other commercial products are positioned.
There's a story about Chris that when he was 9 years old, he had to do homework, I think it was an assignment for school, and you did the research of lemurs, right? And then I was reading this interview that then he ended many years later connecting his first interest and research with lemurs with a malnourished child in Madagascar. How can you make that connection? How that happened?
I think that my interests have always been very much directed toward the protection and the enjoyment of the natural world. But it's been a circuitous route since then. I did an animal project on the ring-tailed lemur in 3rd grade and fell in love with lemurs, and went to Madagascar my first time when I was 16, and have been every year since then. And when I first started working in the Northeast, I can remember that I had been reading Gerald Durrell's book, The I, and I had just this enormous fascination with the I and had wanted to see it. And the first one that I saw was in a hunter's trap and then was being spit roasted over a fire. And for me, it was this terrible experience that turned my stomach, and I very much felt this visceral reaction to that experience. And I knew that I needed to begin working more creatively and innovatively to seek conservation solutions. And so now my position's at a school of public health directed at protecting the health of humanity and focusing on nutrition, but it is also very much trying to find co-beneficial solutions between the two. And so I never thought that I'd end up studying dead animals in the way that I am as food, but it is all about trying to find those connections and those co-benefits between what I think are the two most important things in the world: global biodiversity preservation and human health.
Interesting. Thank you. Anand, every time I see the videos you're creating, and my understanding is that you also create the music, sometimes, not always.
I'm not a musician.
And you create also a narrative, no? So you're using different techniques. You're using the photos, you're using the videos, the music, the narrative, and you connect all of those pieces and create what we just saw. So how do you create them? How do you think about them? Like,
At the beginning, the videos that I made for these projects were actually side projects. They weren't the main goal of the work. It was just little experiments I was running on the side. And the music that I found, I don't create the music, but I find it by accident. I found it by accident in the beginning. And I started to recognize the kind of feeling that it can create when you share it with somebody. And I started realizing, oh, the feeling is actually the most important part. And so when I present this work, I'm including the context, I'm including the information, but I don't expect to be administering a science test at the end of it. Mm-hmm. But I recognize how the information actually creates a deeper connection. It gives this context to enhance the emotional experience, which in the end feels like the most important part.
Yes. So this is the last panel. I see that we have like 1 minute. So to close this incredible symposium festival, what will be the, tweet line, piece of advice for all of us, based on your experience, to go out there and connect and create that empathy? What would you recommend us to do?
For me, it's been a process of reflection. I didn't know anything in advance about what was the right path or what was the most interesting. It was kind of all looking backwards and realizing, oh, wait, this thing that I thought I had to do for my job or for my career or for this thing has meant something to me. And so you're almost learning from your own experience what is the right direction to keep going.
Yeah. For you, Gautam?
Advice to everyone. Yeah, well, advice. Recommendation. One of the things I guess I would say is, as you're thinking about the work that you're doing and you're wanting to communicate it to a larger audience, really just first think about the audience and how will they relate to the work that you're doing, and then think about, okay, how can I then communicate this work to that particular audience?
That's a really good piece of advice. And for you, Chris?
Mine is that I think that we are really just scratching the surface in terms of understanding the many benefits that nature can have on us, and that the next frontier of exploration might be uncovering some of those connections.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Let's give them a round of applause. And thank you. Let's go. Thank you.